My son came home from school on a Tuesday and sat down to eat like usual. He asked if Mom will be home late again, and I said yes. Then he casually said, like he was telling a school story, "Dad, is that man our uncle?" Because he hugged Mom really tight before the car drove away. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name is Valentin Izquierdo Montoya. I'm 52 years old, and for over 25 years I've worked as a tax auditor at the Provincial Tax Office. I'm a man of numbers, not the cold numbers people imagine when they hear that word, but the ones that tell stories, the ones that reveal when someone's lying, when something doesn't add up, when there's a gap between what's said and what really happened. I've spent decades reading balance sheets, cross-referencing dates, identifying patterns where others only see columns of figures. The years taught me that, and that without me looking for it, ended up being the tool that saved me. But before the numbers there was life, and life that Tuesday looked like an ordinary October afternoon. It was October 14th, 2023, a cold Tuesday in the Castilian autumn, one of those where the sun gives up mid-afternoon and the streets smell of damp earth and roasted chestnuts from the corner stalls. I gotten home at 2:30, earlier than usual, because a meeting at the office was canceled without notice, and I decided to take the opportunity to have a quiet lunch. Encarnacion wasn't there. That wasn't strange. She'd been coming home late for months, always with a different explanation, but with the same tone. The tone of someone repeating something they've already rehearsed. I heated up the food, set the table for two, and at 3:15, I heard the sound that ordered my world every afternoon. The building's main door, the small steps on the stairs, and then Simone's voice calling from the landing. "Dad, I'm here." 7 years old, his hair messy as always, the red backpack slung over one shoulder, as if carrying it on both was an unnecessary effort. He came in with that energy kids have, who don't yet know fatigue. He washed his hands because I asked him to before he got to his chair and settled in front of his plate with the serious concentration of someone who's truly hungry. We ate. We talked about what a father and a 7-year-old son talk about, the math test that had gone well, the classmate who'd said something weird during recess, the weekend game. I listened. I answered. It was a day like any other, or so I thought, because disasters, I know now, rarely give a warning. It was then that Simone looked up from his plate. There was no urgency in his face, no sign of what was coming, just the calm expression of someone who just remembered a detail he also wanted to mention, something between the test and the game. "Dad, is that man our uncle?" I put the fork down on the plate. Slowly, not out of alarm. Not yet. "What man, son?" "The one with the gray car, the one who was with Mom before I got here." Tom did something strange at that moment. It didn't stop, because that doesn't happen outside of movies, but it did become denser, as if the air in the kitchen had gained weight without anyone asking it to. I kept looking at Simone. He'd already gone back to eating. For him, it was just another detail of the day, unimportant, something between the test score and what happened at recess. "Where did you see them, Simone?" "On the street behind the school." The car was stopped, and Mom was talking to him, but when she saw me, she got serious, like when I do something bad. And then the man left, and Mom told me he was someone from work. Silence. Just the sound of Simone's fork scraping the bottom of the plate. But she hugged him very tight before the car drove off. "Do people from work hug like that too, Dad?" There was a fly somewhere in the kitchen. I noticed it at that moment without meaning to, because the silence became so complete that any small thing filled the whole space. The fly, the slightly dripping faucet, the sound of the street 5 floors below, and Simone's serene voice, waiting for an answer I hadn't finished processing yet. I smiled. I told him yes, that sometimes coworkers hugged too, that it wasn't strange for him to finish his dessert, that later we had to review the 6 times table. Simone nodded, completely satisfied with the answer, and kept eating. I stayed seated with my back straight, my face in place, with 23 years of marriage crumbling silently inside my chest, while the boy in front of me noticed absolutely nothing. It wasn't anger I felt at that moment. That came later. The first thing was something much colder, the feeling that a number that hadn't added up for a long time had just found its error, and that the error was huge. Encarnacion arrived at 7:10. She was carrying a supermarket bag that no one had asked for and a smile I already knew how to read by heart. The smile of someone who arrives with a story prepared just in case, wrapped in normalcy. She gave me a kiss on the cheek. She asked how my day had been. I told her, fine, quiet, that Simone had gotten a good grade on his test. She visibly relaxed, left the bag on the counter, and started talking about the traffic. I nodded. I answered what was necessary, and while she spoke, I was already looking at something else, not at her, but at the space between what she said and what her words concealed. I'd spent 25 years reading the kind of silence in other people's balance sheets. There was no reason I shouldn't know how to read them in my own. That night, when Encarnacion fell asleep, I stayed awake looking at the ceiling, without moving, without making a sound, remembering every detail of the last few months with an attention I hadn't had before, because before I had no reason to have it. And that's how it all began, not with a scream, not with a scene, not with the dramatic moment one imagines when thinking about the end of a marriage. It began with a fly in the kitchen, a plate of macaroni, and the malice-free voice of a 7-year-old boy asking if people from work hug like that too. There's a difference between suspecting and knowing. Suspicion is noisy. It moves. It doesn't let you sleep. It asks for confirmation at every moment. Knowing, on the other hand, is silent. It's heavy. It settles in the center of your chest like a dense, cold object, and from there it reorganizes everything without asking permission. That night, while Encarnacion slept beside me with the calm breathing of someone who has nothing to fear, I no longer suspected. I didn't have proof yet, but something in the way my mind began to order the last few months told me that what I was looking for was there, waiting for someone to bother to look at it carefully. I didn't move from the bed, I didn't turn on the light, I just stayed still with my eyes open in the dark, letting the memories come on their own, one after another, like pieces of a balance sheet no one had wanted to balance. The first one was from a Friday, in April. Encarnacion had said she had a parent-teacher meeting at Simone's school. I stayed home with the boy at 9 at night. When Simone was already asleep, she arrived with her mascara smudged and explained that one of the mothers had been upset and they had gone out for a drink to calm her down. I believed her without hesitation. At that moment, there was no visible reason not to, but that night, lying in the dark, I remembered that 2 days later, I picked Simone up from school, and the teacher mentioned in passing that the parent-teacher meeting had been the previous week, not the same week the previous one. I let that memory pass, and another one came. A Saturday in June, when Encarnacion said she was going to her friend Soledad's house to help her with some moving boxes. She left at 11 in the morning in comfortable clothes and came back at 7 in the evening with her hair up differently than how she'd worn it when she left. Nothing striking, a tiny detail. But 3 weeks later, Simone asked me when they were going to visit Soledad, because he hadn't seen her in a long time. That same afternoon, I asked Encarnacion about it. She hesitated for a second before answering that Soledad had been very busy with work, just a 1-second pause, but I've spent decades analyzing statements, and I know exactly what a second of hesitation at the wrong time is worth. The memories kept coming without a rush, as if they'd been stored in a line waiting for their turn. On Thursday, October 12th, just 2 days before the conversation in the kitchen, Encarnacion came home with a perfume I hadn't given her and that I didn't recognize among hers. It was discreet, not flashy, the kind someone chooses precisely so it doesn't attract attention. I noticed it when she came to greet me, but I filed it away in that mental compartment where one keeps things they prefer not to examine too closely. Now that compartment was wide open, and what I found inside no longer allowed for alternative interpretations. There were other details. The weekends when Simone stayed with Amelia, the neighbor from the 4th floor, without my having asked for it, and without Encarnacion explaining it beyond, and I need to go out for a moment, and I don't want to bother you. I wasn't always busy. Sometimes I was just at home reading, and the boy would go anyway. At the time, I thought it was a considerate gesture. That night, I understood that Simone's absence wasn't for anyone's convenience. It was a necessary condition for something I wasn't supposed to see. And then there was the matter of the phone. It wasn't a specific episode that came to mind, but a new habit that Encarnacion had gradually incorporated over the last few months. Always carrying it with her, even at home, even on a Sunday morning in her pajamas. Before, she'd leave it on any surface. Before, I could ask for it to look up a number and she'd pass it to me without a second thought. Now, if I got close while she was looking at the screen, she'd turn it with a gesture that was meant to be natural. Meant to be, but wasn't. There's a question that soon appears when one tells these things. Why wasn't a man who spends his professional life identifying anomalies able to see his own? It's a fair question, and it deserves an honest answer. The truth is there are things you don't look for, because doing so would mean finding them. And there are entire lives built on the silent decision not to look too closely at certain corners. I had built 23 years on that decision, not out of cowardice, but out of faith. Because when you've spent more than 2 decades waking up every morning next to the same person, faith becomes a habit so ingrained that it borders on blindness. That night, I understood the exact price of having done so. I got up at 4:15 in the morning. I went to the kitchen carefully, without turning on the hallway lights. I poured myself a glass of water and stood in front of the window, looking at the empty street below. The cold of the floor seeped through my socks. A night bus passed in the distance, its windows lit and no passengers visible. Everything was still. In that silence that smells of early morning and turned-off heating, I made the only decision that made sense. I wasn't going to act out of pain. I was going to act based on information because pain makes mistakes and I couldn't afford any. I learned that in my first years of my career when a colleague with much more experience than me told me something I never quite forgot. That a report presented with trembling hands is a report full of cracks, and that cracks are the first thing someone who wants to discredit you looks for. That man's name was Evaristo. He'd been retired for years, but that morning, standing in the kitchen, glass in hand, I thanked him in silence. I went back to bed before 5. Encarnacion was still asleep in the same position. I got on my side, closed my eyes, and for the first time in hours, I breathed slowly and with purpose. I wasn't going to say anything yet. I wasn't going to alter any gesture, any routine, any of the habits we'd accumulated in 23 years under the same roof. I was going to observe, I was going to document, and when I had everything I needed, without flaws and without loose ends, then I would make my move. But not before. It was dawning when I finally managed to close my eyes. In the next room, Simone was sleeping with that absolute tranquility that only children who know they're loved have. He had no idea what he had unleashed with 12 words spoken between one bite and the next. And I thought before falling asleep that if I could prevent him from ever knowing, I would. That morning, when the alarm went off at 7:30, I got up, showered, put on my usual suit, and had breakfast with Encarnacion and Simone, as if the previous night had been any other night. I asked her if she needed me to pick anything up on the way home. I tied his shoelaces before he ran to the door. I said goodbye to them both from the landing with the same voice as always, and I went down to the car carrying something inside that neither of them could see, the methodical and precise calm of a man who already knows exactly what he has to do and who is in no hurry to do it wrong. For 25 years, my job consisted of finding what others didn't want me to find. I'm not talking about big frauds or elaborate operations like in the movies. I'm talking about something much more common and much more human. The small error, the figure that doesn't fit, the pattern that repeats too many times. Most tax irregularities aren't born from the genius of the defrauder. They're born from habit, from excessive confidence that no one is going to look closely enough. I learned that in my first years on the job, and over time it became an instinct I couldn't turn off even if I wanted to. On Wednesday, October 16th, 2 days after the conversation with Simone, I arrived at the office 40 minutes earlier than usual. I greeted the security guard at the entrance, took the stairs instead of the elevator as I always did, and settled into my office before the fluorescent lights in the hallway had finished turning on completely. I didn't open my work files. I opened the online banking portal from the personal computer I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I used exclusively for my own affairs. We had 2 joint accounts, the current one for day-to-day things, and the savings one where we deposited a fixed amount each month for emergencies and for Simone's studies when the time came. There was also an account in my name, only mine, where my salary from the office was deposited, and an additional card linked to the current account that Encarnacion used for household expenses. I started with the transactions on the additional card, not because I expected to find anything there immediately, but because that's where any serious analysis always begins, at the point that seems most innocent. The first 3 months I reviewed, January, February, and March of that same year, showed a usual flow. Supermarket, pharmacy, gas station, an occasional clothing store purchase, nothing out of the ordinary. The average monthly amount was consistent with what we'd spent in previous years within a reasonable margin of variation. But in April, something changed. Not suddenly, nothing worth examining ever changes that way. It was gradual, almost imperceptible to someone who wasn't looking for precisely that. A series of charges at restaurants that hadn't appeared with that frequency before, restaurants I didn't recognize, cafes at times that didn't correspond to any routine of Encarnaciones that I knew. Moderate amounts, none over 80 euros, all perfectly reasonable separately, but together, seen in sequence, they drew a cadence that had its own internal rhythm. Every 10 or 12 days, with a regularity that wasn't coincidental, I noted the dates in a notepad I took from the second drawer. Blue pen, small, tight handwriting, like when I prepare a field report. I put them in a column, one under the other, and I looked at them. April, 3 charges. May 4, June 3, July 2nd, but at mid-price hotels that hadn't appeared in previous months. August, none, which coincided with the month we'd been on vacation together on the coast. The 3 of us, Encarnacion, Simone, and me. September, for restaurant charges, and one that stopped me completely. The September charge was from a flower shop. 107.50 euros on a Friday afternoon. That Friday, I had picked Simone up from school because Encarnacion had said she had a medical checkup that had run long. She came home empty-handed, with no flowers, with nothing to justify that expense in any domestic context I could imagine. I put the pen down on a notepad and leaned back in my chair. The office was still silent. Outside, in the hallway, the first conversations of the day were starting, the sound of the coffee from the machine at the end, chairs moving. I was sitting in the middle of all that, and at the same time completely on the sidelines, in a place where time worked differently. I kept looking at the statement, now with more attention than before, looking for what I hadn't found yet. The transfer, because the card charges could be explained in many ways to someone who didn't know how to read the data well. But a recurring bank transfer to an unknown account is something else. It's a commitment. It's someone who decided that the other person deserved a constant and planned effort. I found in October of the previous year, 2022, a transfer of 300 euros to an account number that wasn't in any of our usual records. No description, just the account number and the date. The next month, another the same amount, and the next and the next. 12 consecutive months until March of that year, when the amount went up to 450 euros and the frequency remained the same. Since then, without interruption, the same destination, the same day of each month, with a punctuality that spoke of a consolidated agreement, not an impulse. I did the calculation in the margin of the notepad. I didn't need a calculator. For 1,800 euros in the first stretch, and then 3,600 more up to the moment I was sitting there reading that. 8,400 euros in total to an account that wasn't mine, that wasn't for any service I contracted, and that didn't appear in any expense Encarnacion had ever mentioned to me. I put the notepad in my briefcase, closed the banking portal, turned off the personal computer, and put it back in the bottom drawer, in exactly the same position it was always in. Then I opened the day's files and started working. Not because the account issue could wait indefinitely, but because I knew from experience that incomplete information is the worst starting point for any decision. What I had that morning was enough to know that something had been happening for months right under my nose. It wasn't enough to know exactly what, or with whom, or how deep it all went. And acting on incomplete information wasn't an option I was willing to consider. I had learned that from Evaristo too, that veteran colleague from my early years at the office. He told me one afternoon, while we were reviewing a complicated file together, that half-baked data is more dangerous than ignorance, because it gives you enough confidence to act and enough gaps to make a mistake. I'd agreed with him. Then, that October morning, with my briefcase closed at my feet and the file open on the table. I thanked him a second time. That afternoon, I picked Simone up from school like any other day. We walked home along the long street, the one that goes by the square with the stone fountain that he liked to circle twice before continuing. I listened to him talk about school, his friends, a movie he wanted to see over the weekend. I answered everything. I laughed at the right moments. I bought him a pastry at the corner bakery because it was Wednesday, and on Wednesdays I always bought him one. Encarnacion came home at 7:15 looking tired and with a plastic bag with bread and yogurts. She gave me a kiss on the cheek, asked Simone how his day had been. She put the yogurts in the fridge. Everything normal, everything perfectly, carefully normal. And I smiled, I answered, I served dinner, and I kept inside me. With the same precision, I archived any file, every piece of data I still needed to find. There's an unwritten rule in auditing that took me years to fully understand. Never act on what you think you know. Act only on what you can prove. The difference between those two things isn't semantic. It's the difference between winning a case and losing it, between being right and being able to prove it. That distinction, which I'd applied hundreds of times to others' files, was now what separated me from the mistake I couldn't afford to make. The account number to which 8,400 euros had been transferred wasn't enough on its own. It was a thread, and you have to pull threads patiently, not by yanking them all at once. I'd known Aurelio Santa Maria Vidal for 11 years. I'd met him during a joint investigation between the tax office and the provincial police's economic crime unit, when we were both working on the same case from different angles. He was a methodical man, discreet to the extreme, with the kind of look you don't get in any academy, but from years of observing people who don't want to be observed. When he took early retirement from the police at 47 due to a knee problem that no longer allowed him the pace of field work, he opened a private investigation service in the same city. We'd seen each other 3 times since then, always casually, but the kind of trust built by working side by side on something delicate doesn't fade with time, it just goes dormant. I called him from the landline in my home office on a Thursday morning while Encarnacion was at the market and Simone was at school. I told him I needed to talk to him, no details, just that. Aurelio responded with the same economy of words that characterized him. Whenever you want. We arranged to meet the following Monday at a cafe downtown that neither of us frequented. I arrived 10 minutes early, ordered coffee, and let it cool on the table. Aurelio came in on time, sat across from me, ordered water, and waited. I explained the situation with just the right amount of precision, the account number, the amount, the frequency, the period. I gave him a copy of the statement with that single transaction marked, the rest covered with a blank sheet of paper. I didn't want him to have more information than necessary to start. Aurelio looked at it for a few seconds, folded it, put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and said only one thing before getting up. Give me 10 days. I took them. 10 days in which domestic life continued with the same calm surface as always. Mornings with Simone, dinners with Encarnacion, reports at the office, afternoons in the square. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, it was like living in a room whose walls were closing in by a millimeter per hour. You don't see the movement, but you feel it. Aurelio called me on the 9th day, not the 10th. He had one to spare. We met again at the same cafe. Same time in the morning, same table in the back. This time he arrived before me. He had a thin brown folder on the table, closed, with his hands resting on top as if it would fly away if he moved them. He passed it to me as soon as I sat down. I opened it. The first page was a file with a name, date of birth, and professional activity. Leandro Crespo Barrios, 38 years old, sole administrator and majority shareholder of a real estate development company based in the business park north of the city. The second page was a summary of business activity. The company was 6 years old, with an average annual turnover of over €1 million, no registered public debts. The third page was the one that stopped me. It was a photograph taken from a vehicle with a telephoto lens on a street I recognized immediately, the street behind Simone's school, the same one my son had described to me 11 days earlier between one bite and the next. In the photo, Encarnacion had her back to the camera, partially covered by the open door of a gray car. In front of her, facing the camera without knowing it, was a man with dark hair, medium build, wearing a navy blue shirt and an expression that wasn't that of someone saying goodbye to an acquaintance. Leandro Crespo Barrios, 38 years old. 8 years younger than Encarnacion and 14 younger than me. I don't know how long I looked at that photograph. The coffee they brought me was still untouched. Aurelio said nothing. He was a man who knew perfectly well when silence was the only appropriate language. The fourth page contained a summary of surveillance. Aurelio had identified the first documented meeting between them at a business event held at the Hotel Palacio del Pinar on Friday, March 3rd of the previous year, 2022. A networking event for the real estate and services sector that Encarnacion had attended on behalf of the consulting firm where she worked as a project coordinator. I remember that Friday. I remembered having dinner alone with Simone because she said the event ended late. I remembered thinking it was a shame she worked so much. 18 months. The relationship had been going on for 18 months since that first night at the downtown hotel. 18 months of Fridays with different excuses, of charges at restaurants with hours that didn't fit, of regular transfers to an account that now had a name and surname. I folded the folder, placed it on my lap, and asked Aurelio how much I owed him for the work. He gave me a figure. I transferred the amount to him that same afternoon from a personal account that Encarnacion didn't know about, opened years ago to manage a small inheritance from my father. I didn't want any traceable movements on the joint statements. Aurelio got up, and before leaving, he put a hand on my shoulder for a moment without saying anything and walked towards the door with that calm stride of his, the stride of someone who has seen too many things for anything to still faze him. That afternoon I got home before Simone. I went into the office, locked the door, something I didn't usually do, and placed a brown folder in the back of the bottom drawer of the wardrobe behind a box of car insurance documents. Then I sat in the swivel chair and stayed still for a long time, with my hands on my thighs and my eyes on the opposite wall. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about this. I didn't cry at that moment. I felt something more like a numbness, like when you touch something very cold and your fingers take a few seconds to register the real sensation. The pain would come later, with all its precision. That afternoon, I was still in that strange interval between the blow and the moment the body understands what it received. When I heard the building's main door and the small steps on the stairs, I put the office key in my jacket pocket. I opened the door before Simone called out and greeted him with the same voice as always. How was school? He told me it was good, that he'd had pee and was tired, but hungry. I told him that was perfect, that his snack was in the kitchen, and while he dropped the red backpack on the hallway floor and ran to the fridge, I stood for a second in the office doorway with the door ajar behind me and the brown folder stored in the drawer, thinking that the time had come to call Tomas Revenja. Tomas Renga Ochoa was 58 years old, with 22 years of practice as a family lawyer and a quality I valued above any frame degree in his office. He never said what you wanted to hear. He said what was true, even if it was hard, even if the truth came without the wrapping you'd prefer. I met him in 1998 when we both lived in the same building on Carretera Street and shared the same impossible schedule of young men trying to build something out of ours. We had lost touch for a few years and had reconnected later, as happens with certain people whose presence in one's life doesn't depend on frequency, but on solidity. I called him on a Monday morning from the home office phone with the door locked and Simone at school. I told him I needed to see him in a professional context, not a personal one, professional. Tomas understood the difference without me explaining it and scheduled me for the following Wednesday at 4 p.m. at his downtown office. While I waited for that Wednesday, I did what no other man in my situation could have done with the same coldness. I sat in front of the personal computer with all the bank statements from the last 20 months, Aurelio's folder open to my left, and a pad of graph paper to my right. I did what I've been doing for decades with other people's files. I built a correspondence table. In the left column, the dates Aurelio had documented, verified meetings, recorded trips, nights away from home with a work alibi. In the middle column, the charges on the additional card that coincided with those dates, restaurants, mid-priced hotels, a jewelry store in May that had gone completely unnoticed among other expenses that month. In the right column, the monthly transfers to Leandro Crespo's account, which weren't direct transfers in his name, but to an account of which he was the holder, according to the cross-reference data Aurelio had included in the dossier. The work took me 2 full afternoons. Encarnacion thought I was reviewing files from the office. It wasn't an unreasonable assumption. There were nights when I really did. This time, the files were different. When I finished the table, I checked it twice from top to bottom before adding it up. It was a professional habit I'd never abandoned. Verify before concluding, because errors in the totals are the most embarrassing and the most avoidable. The first review showed no difference from the second. The numbers were the same. I picked up the pen and wrote the total in the bottom right margin of the last page. Inside a box I drew with a ruler, 12,840 euros. I stared at that figure for a time I didn't measure, not because the amount itself surprised me, which was significant but not devastating in absolute terms, but because of what each euro broken down in that table represented. There were restaurants from a Friday when I had picked Simone up from school and had done his math homework with him at the kitchen table. There was a charge at a hotel in the mountains on a weekend in January when I had taken the boy to the doctor because he had a high fever and Encarnacion had said she couldn't cancel a work commitment. There was a transfer on my birthday, February 22nd, a date that had no sentimental value for Leandro Crespo Barrios, but which for me was now marked with something I won't name because it still hurts to name it. It was the money. The money was recoverable. What was irreplaceable were the hours that table represented, hours of my daily life, of Simone's life, of a routine I had believed was shared and which in reality had been the backdrop against which something completely different was built. I put the table inside a transparent plastic sleeve, placed it next to Aurelio's folder in the wardrobe drawer, and turned off the computer. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it standing by the window, looking at the building's inner courtyard, where a neighbor from the second floor had put out a chair to read with the afternoon upon him. Everything was in its place. The life of the building continued with absolute indifference to what was happening inside my head. On Wednesday, I arrived at Tomas's office on time. It was a tidy, unpretentious space, with dark wood shelves up to the ceiling and a desk that bore the natural scratches of 20 years of use. I liked that office precisely for that reason. It was the office of someone who actually worked, not someone who wanted to impress whoever walked in. I put the plastic sleeve with the table and Aurelio's folder on his desk. Tomas reviewed everything without rushing, with the same neutral expression I recognized from the years we'd been neighbors, and he'd come home with files under his arm. When he finished, he gathered the papers carefully, put them back in the sleeve, and crossed his hands on the table. "How long have you known this?" 19 days since the first concrete suspicion, 9 since I had confirmation. Tomas nodded slowly. Then he explained to me, with that clarity of his that never sought euphemisms, what the available avenues were, what could be proven with what I had, what would need to be further documented to support a divorce proceeding with cause and with a property claim. The financial deviations were relevant, but they needed support in the form of official bank documentation, not just screenshots of downloaded statements. Aurelio's material was valid as a guide, but in court, it would need to be supplemented with reports that met the formal requirements for admissible evidence. I asked him how long he estimated it would take to get everything in order. He said it depended on how quickly I could provide him with the certified bank documentation. I replied that I could have it in a week. Tomas said that was enough to start building. Before I got up, he added something I hadn't asked, but that he considered necessary to say, "Valentin, what you have here is solid, but I want you to know that this is going to be a long process, not weeks. Months. And during those months, you're going to have to keep living as if nothing has changed. Are you in a position to do that?" I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the 19 days I had already been doing it, about the dinners, the mornings, the kisses on the cheek that said nothing of what I knew. Then I answered, "I'm already doing it." Tomas didn't smile or nod. He just picked up the plastic sleeve, locked it in his desk drawer, and told me to call him when I had the certified bank documentation. I went out into the street with the October chill on my face. The mid-afternoon traffic filled the city center with that constant, formless noise that cities have when no one is paying attention to anything in particular. I walked to the car without rushing, my hands in my pockets and my head clearer than at any time in the last 3 weeks. That night, sitting at the table with Encarnacion and Simone, while he told a story from school with that unceasing energy of his. There was a moment when Encarnacion looked at me and smiled with that familiar, calm expression of so many years. And I returned the smile with the same naturalness, without visible effort, with all the composure of a man who already knows exactly where he's going, even if he hasn't gotten there yet. The number was still written in the margin of that graph paper, locked away in Tomas's drawer. 12,840 euros, each with its date, each with its story, and each from that moment on, turned into a piece in a process that had already begun to move without anyone at that table knowing it. There was a night at the end of October when everything I thought I knew about the damage I could receive became obsolete in the time it took me to read 3 lines on a screen. Encarnacion had fallen asleep on the sofa after dinner. It happened with some frequency when she came home exhausted, especially on Thursdays, which were usually long days at her job. Simone was already in bed since 9. The house was in that particular silence of weeknights, with the low murmur of the television. No one was watching, and the hallway light on out of habit. I was at the other end of the sofa with a book I hadn't made progress on for days. Encarnacion was sleeping slightly tilted towards the armrest with her phone resting on her thigh, screen up. At some point, without my looking for it, the screen lit up with the vibration of a message. I saw it light up from the corner of my eye. I didn't mean to look. I'd spent weeks living with that screen she always protected and had never tried to force anything. But at that moment, the angle was exact, the light was sufficient, and the name in the notification was Daniela's. I didn't move for several seconds. Encarnacion's breathing didn't change. I got up slowly from the sofa, picked up the phone with the same care one picks up something fragile, and took it towards the lamp in the corner. The screen was still unlocked. The notification showed the beginning of the message. Mom, I've been thinking about this for days, and I need to tell you that the rest wasn't visible from the notification. I had to open the conversation. What I found wasn't just that message. It was a thread of weeks of exchanges between mother and daughter about a matter I recognized immediately, because the context was impossible to misinterpret. There were no explicit names in the recent messages, just pronouns and veiled references. But the language of someone talking about something they don't want to name directly is as recognizable as that of someone lying to your face. It uses roundabout ways as its architecture. I scrolled up in the thread until I found the point where the messages became more direct. It was in an exchange from early September, almost 2 months before that night. Daniela had written, "Mom, you have to be more careful. Last week, when I saw you both in the downtown parking lot, there were people around. Not everyone is as discreet as me." I read that line twice, then a third time. My daughter had seen Encarnacion with Leandro in a public parking lot, and the tone of the message wasn't that of someone who has just found out about something by accident. It was the tone of someone who has known for a while and uses a new incident to remind the other person that the risk exists. It was the voice of someone who has already processed the information, made a decision about it, and moved on with their life. Encarnacion's response, sent 20 minutes after that message, was brief. "I know. It won't happen again in a place like that. And thanks for not saying anything. You know, all this is complicated. Thanks for not saying anything." I returned the phone to Encarnacion's thigh, in exactly the same position it was in, with the screen facing up. Then I went back to my spot on the sofa and opened the book without seeing any of the words in front of me. Daniela was 21 years old. She had grown up in that house, in those same rooms, under that same roof I had paid for 2 decades. She had seen the end of my youth and the beginning of my maturity with the calm perspective of someone who never had to worry because there was always someone who worried for her. She knew what her mother was doing. She chose silence and, on top of that, received thanks for that choice. This is the hardest part of this whole story to tell, and I need to be honest here, even if the honesty doesn't favor me. For years, I wasn't as present as I should have been for Daniela. There was a time when she was between 10 and 14 when work at the office absorbed me in a way that's now hard for me to justify. I get home late, leave early, and weekends were often filled with files that couldn't wait. I'm not saying this to downplay what Daniela did. I'm saying it because lying by omission in one's own story is exactly the kind of fault I couldn't allow myself to reproach in others. My absence in those years doesn't justify her silence, but it's part of the complete map of what happened, and that map needs to be shown in its entirety. What Daniela chose wasn't just not to speak, it was to place herself somewhere, and that place had implications that she, at that moment, perhaps didn't fully calibrate. I went to bed before Encarnacion, woke up from the sofa. I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the silence of the apartment. That thick kind of silence that only exists in the early morning when everything you have to think about can no longer wait until tomorrow. At some point between 1 and 3, I heard Encarnacion enter the bedroom, moving carefully, settling on her side of the bed without turning on any lights. Her breathing became regular in a few minutes. Mine took much longer. What I felt in those hours didn't have the heat of anger. It was something closer to the disorientation of someone who thought they knew every room in their own house and had just found a door that was always there, closed, that no one had bothered to mention. It wasn't just a marriage that was built on a false foundation. It was part of the story I had told myself for years about what my family meant. That story now had a new crack, different in nature from the first, and much harder to place in any column of any table. At 6:15, I got up. I showered with the water colder than usual because I needed something physical and concrete to bring me back to the present. I made Simone's breakfast. When the boy came down with his hair messy and his eyes still heavy with sleep, I sat him in front of the bowl of milk without saying anything unnecessary and tied his sneakers before he ran to the door. Before closing my briefcase that morning, I opened the pad of graph paper and added a single line at the end of the notes with the same handwriting as always. Daniela has known since at least September 2023, possibly earlier. Then I closed the pad, placed it next to the day's files, and went out into the street. There were two things absolutely clear from that moment. First, the process moving forward with Tomas would continue exactly as planned, without alterations or urgency. Second, when the time came, Daniela wouldn't be on the sidelines of what was to come. What she had decided to keep silent had its own weight. And that weight, sooner or later, was going to find a place to rest. No one keeps the wrong silence without that silence leaving some mark, not even children. There's a form of fatigue that doesn't appear in any medical diagnosis, and yet is one of the most exhausting that exists. The fatigue of maintaining a version of yourself that no longer corresponds to anything real. It's not the fatigue of working too much or sleeping poorly. It's that of holding hour after hour, day after day, a face that doesn't reflect what's behind it. Actors call it work. I called it November because that's exactly what that month was, a continuous and silent job that began the moment the alarm clock rang and ended, if it ever ended, at some point in the early morning when exhaustion finally overcame everything else. The mornings had their own unchangeable routine. Breakfast, Simone's sneakers, the orange juice that Encarnacion always prepared for herself before leaving. Everything was still in its place. I answered questions, made comments about the weather or the traffic, listened to the day's plans with an attention that from the outside seemed genuine. Encarnacion didn't notice any difference. Or if she did, she interpreted it as the ordinary fatigue of a man in his 50s who has been carrying files for too many years. Maybe that was also part of why she had gotten to where she was. I'd been predictable for so long that any variation in my behavior found a domestic explanation before it became a suspicion. There was a Tuesday in mid-November that I remember with a precision I haven't deliberately sought. It had been a complicated day at the office, with a review meeting that went on longer than planned and a file that had inconsistencies needing a second look. I got home at 7:30, left my briefcase at the entrance, and as I passed through the living room, I saw Encarnacion and Simone sitting together on the sofa. She was reading something to him with the book open between them, and the boy had his head resting on her shoulder with his eyes half closed. It was an image of such complete normalcy, so domestic, so similar to hundreds of identical images from recent years, that I stopped at the threshold without either of them seeing me yet. Encarnacion was a good mother. I need to say that with the same honesty I've told everything else, because it would be easy to build a narrative where she was only what she did, and that wouldn't be true. With Simone, She was always present, patient, attentive to the small details that make a child feel safe. She read to him every night since he was 3. She remembered his classmates' birthdays when he forgot them. She knew when he was sad before he knew it himself. All of that was real and remained real that night. And the fact that what I kept in Tomas's drawer was also true didn't cancel out this other part. People aren't just their worst acts, but they don't cease to be them for having good moments. I moved. Encarnacion looked up and smiled at me. Simone opened his eyes fully and said he was almost asleep. I told him then it was the perfect time to go to bed. He protested with the residual energy he had left, and I walked him to his room, helped him put on his pajamas, and sat on the edge of his bed until his breathing evened out completely. Then I went to the hallway bathroom, locked the bolt, turned on the sink faucet, and stood in front of the mirror with the water running. I'm not going to describe what happened in that bathroom in detail, because there are things that belong to a man's strictly private space and gain nothing from being narrated. I'll just say that it took several minutes for the tap water to be useful for anything again, and that when I turned off the tap and dried my face with the towel, the man in the mirror had exactly the same appearance as always, which seemed to me both a relief and something quite sad. The following days progressed with that cadence that weeks acquire when you're living pending something that hasn't arrived yet. Tomas and I met about every 10 days, always in his office, always with the door closed. The process moved forward with the methodical slowness that things built to last have. The certified bank documentation was already in his possession. Aurelio's records had been supplemented with a formal report that met the admissibility requirements Tomas had detailed, and the initial draft of the writ was taking shape. Each meeting ended with Tomas telling me it was going well, that we should be patient. Patience was the only thing I had in abundance. It wasn't a virtue, it was a necessity. There was a night in the first week of December when weeks of work almost came undone. Daniela had called in the afternoon to talk to her mother, and from the office, I overheard, unintentionally, the tone of the conversation, laughter, confidences, that specific complicity between a woman and her adult daughter that one recognizes immediately because it has its own music. They hung up after almost an hour. Encarnacion came into the office to tell me that Daniela was asking if we could stop by her apartment the next weekend for lunch. I said that sounded good, that we should write it down. When Encarnacion left, I stood for several minutes with the phone in my hand. I had Daniela's number on the screen, undialed. In my head, I had already constructed the first 3 sentences of that conversation, direct, without shouting, with the central question posed in a way that allowed no evasion. How long did you know? Why didn't you say anything? What exactly were you thinking when your father came home knowing nothing? I put the phone in the drawer, not because I didn't have reason to call, I did, but because calling at that moment would have been acting out of distress. And distress has never produced anything that holds up. There was a planned sequence, everything in its own time. The conversation with Daniela would come, but not before everything else was in its place. The following Saturday, I went to lunch at Daniela's apartment with Encarnacion and Simone, as if there were no invisible thread running through that table. My daughter had cooked a stew that my mother had taught her years ago. She set the table with a tablecloth, something she didn't usually do. She was attentive to the boy throughout the meal. She asked me about work with an interest that seemed genuine. I answered everything. I praised the stew, which was really good. I helped Simone cut his meat because he still had trouble with it. I stayed to wash the dishes because I'd always done that when we ate at someone else's house. And at no point during the 3 hours we were there did I give any sign of what I knew. Not a gesture, not an extra pause, not a silence that could be read in any other way. That was the hardest part of that whole period. Not the pain, which had its own rhythm and its own schedule, but the distance between what I felt and what I showed, which widened a little more each week, like a crack in a wall that one watches without being able to do anything until the time comes to intervene. In the car on the way back, with Simone asleep in the back seat and Encarnacion looking out the window, I parked in the building's garage and turned off the engine. She went in with Simone in her arms without waiting. I stayed sitting in the car with my hands on the steering wheel and the garage silent around me. It was in that garage, with the smell of cold concrete and motor oil that all the world's garages have, that I asked myself the only question I had been avoiding for weeks. If at the end of all this, when every process had reached its conclusion and everything was in its place, I was going to find something on the other side that was worth what it was costing to get there. I didn't find an answer that night. Sometimes important questions don't come with immediate answers, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. I got out of the car, locked it, and went up in the elevator to the 4th floor. Tomas had told me everything would be ready in January. January wasn't far away. January arrived with the dry cold of the Castilian Plateau, the kind that doesn't wet but cuts. And with it also came the call from Tomas, which I had been waiting for weeks without rushing him. It was a Thursday morning, past 10, and I was reviewing a field report at the office when the phone vibrated on the desk with his name on the screen. "We can meet this week," he said. "The material is complete." We arranged to meet the following Friday at 5 in the afternoon. That week was the longest of the last 3 months. Not because I lacked work to fill the hours, but because there's a kind of waiting that nothing can fill, the waiting of someone who has already made all the necessary decisions and is only waiting for the moment to set them in motion. Tomas's office smelled of old paper and fresh coffee when I entered. He was standing by the back bookshelf with a thick folder open in his hands, reviewing something in silence. He pointed to the chair with a gesture without looking up. He finished reading what he had in his hands and sat across from me with that calm of his that I had never quite learned to imitate. On the table were 3 folders arranged by size, with different colored tabs peeking out from the edges. Tomas started with the bulkiest one. "This is the main one," he said. "Certified bank documentation. Official statements for the last 20 months. Transfers identified with verified ownership of the receiving account. All in chronological order with marginal notes that facilitate reading in a judicial setting." The second folder was thinner, but no less relevant. It contained Aurelio's formalized report, which met the admissibility requirements Tomas had detailed at the time. Documented dates, location records, photographic material with verifiable metadata. 2 confirmed meetings between Encarnacion and Leandro Crespo. Over 16 months in locations ranging from restaurants to a short-term rental apartment on the northern outskirts of the city that Aurelio had identified in the last week of November and which didn't appear in any of our joint expenses. That detail was new. I processed it without interrupting Tomas. The third folder was the one he had built from the data I myself had progressively provided over the last 2 months. The detailed record of Encarnacion's absences on days and times of shared responsibility with Simone. This wasn't irregularly obtained data. These were dates I had documented with precision from the beginning of this whole process, noted in the pad of graph paper that Tomas had incorporated into the file as the petitioner's statement. 12 occasions in 9 months in which Simone had remained in the care of third parties, mostly Amelia, the 4th floor neighbor, during Encarnacion's absences that coincided with the dates documented in Aurelio's report. 4 of those occasions had been on a Saturday or Sunday. 2 of them had occurred on workdays when Simone was sick and didn't go to school. Tomas closed the third folder and crossed his hands on the table. On the financial side, he said, "The position is solid. The diversions are proven with documentation that doesn't allow for a reasonable alternative interpretation. Regarding custody, the record of absences, along with a history of primary care that you can prove over the last 2 years, builds a consistent argument for requesting primary custody of Simone. It's not a guarantee, because nothing in a judicial process is, but the starting point is favorable." I asked him about the timeline. He explained that the complaint was drafted and just needed my signature to be filed. Once filed, Encarnacion would be formally notified and the procedure would begin. Before that, he recommended a preliminary step that he considered strategically convenient, a confrontation meeting in his office with him present as a professional witness, where I could present the documentation directly to Encarnacion before she received it through legal channels. I asked him why. "Because the legal route is longer, more emotionally costly for all parties, and especially for the child," he replied. "If in that meeting Encarnacion accepts the terms we're going to propose, the process can be resolved in a much more orderly manner. If she doesn't accept them, we file the complaint the next day and let the document speak in court. Either way, you arrive with everything in hand. She arrives not knowing what's on the table. It was impeccable logic. It was exactly the kind of reasoning I would have applied to any work file. Don't force a conflict when a more efficient path is available, but have your position of strength completely consolidated before sitting down to negotiate. I signed the authorization document for the meeting that same afternoon. Tomas would call Encarnacion the following week with a neutral pretext, a review of the couple's tax situation, something that wouldn't raise alarm but would justify her presence at a lawyer's office. It wasn't a lie. It was technically part of what would be discussed. I went out into the street when the January sky was already completely dark, with that deep blue of 5 in the afternoon in winter that makes the lights of the shops seem warmer than they are. I walked to the car without rushing. The folders remained locked in Tomas's office, where no one who shouldn't have access could find them. That night, Encarnacion came home with an unusual, almost luminous energy, the kind you associate with someone whose affairs are going well and who sees no reason to anticipate otherwise. She had bought a bottle of wine that wasn't for any special occasion, just because she felt like it, she said. She put on music in the kitchen while she prepared dinner. She sang a little, in a low voice, a song I remembered from the early years of our marriage. Simone ate with appetite, talked about school, laughed at something he recounted with more drama than the facts required. Encarnacion listened to him with complete attention, clapped at the opportune moment, ruffled his hair before sending him to brush his teeth. I replied. I participated in that after-dinner conversation with the same presence as always. And as I did, I thought of Tomas dialing Encarnacion's number the following week with the pretext of a tax review. I thought of her answering without any suspicion, noting the appointment in her calendar with the tranquility of someone who has nothing to fear from a lawyer calling about a routine matter. I thought about what she didn't know, about the 3 folders arranged on Tomas's table, about the drafted, signed writ, ready to be filed the day after that meeting if she decided she wouldn't accept anything. The bottle of wine she had bought was still on the counter, half finished. Encarnacion had her back to me, collecting the glasses from the sink, with no visible reason to be on guard. And I, sitting at that table I had known for 23 years, knew with a clarity that needed no number to back it up that the time for waiting was over. Tomas called Encarnacion the following Tuesday mid-morning from his office number. I was at the office when he sent me a brief message confirming he had spoken with her. She had accepted the appointment without questions, with the casual tone of someone noting a routine administrative commitment. They set it for Thursday at 4:30 in the afternoon. Thursday dawned with a low fog that didn't lift all day. I went to the office at my usual time. I worked all morning with a concentration that surprised me. I had a sandwich at my desk because I had no appetite for anything more elaborate. And at 3:15 I got up, put on my jacket, picked up my briefcase, and left. I arrived at Tomas's office 40 minutes before Encarnacion. The 3 folders were on the table, exactly where I had left them the week before, with the colored tabs in the same order. Tomas also had a second set of documents prepared in an additional, thinner folder that he would describe if the situation required it. That folder contained, among other things, the screenshot of the message thread between Encarnacion and Daniela, obtained in a way that Tomas had verified was legally usable as the petitioner's statement. We sat down. Tomas reviewed in a low voice the order in which he would present the material. I listened, nodded at the points where it was appropriate to nod, and when he finished speaking, we sat in silence for a couple of minutes. The wall clock in the office read 4:18. Encarnacion arrived at 4:27. She came in with her coat on, her bag slung over her shoulder, a neutral expression of someone coming to handle a formality. She greeted Tomas politely and me with her usual naturalness, and sat in the chair opposite us without anyone explicitly telling her to. Tomas began to speak. He was direct, without unnecessary preambles, with the professional and emotionless tone of someone who has had this conversation enough times to know that beating around the bush serves no one. He explained who he was in that context, in what capacity he was present, and what the real reason for the meeting was. Then he opened the first folder and placed it on the table facing Encarnacion. The change in her face wasn't immediate. It took a few seconds, the time she needed to process what she was seeing. First, there was the slight frown of someone who doesn't understand, then something more like caution, and then, when her eyes scanned the first page and recognized the numbers and dates, something that was neither of the previous two things. "This isn't what it looks like," she said. Her voice was still firm, but it had a crack at the edge that I recognized because I had been listening to that voice in all its variations for 23 years. Tomas didn't respond to that. He simply moved on to the second folder and opened it in the same direction. The photographs from Aurelio's report, the documented dates, the names of the establishments with their corresponding charges. Encarnacion looked away from the papers and looked at me directly for the first time since she had entered. "Valentin." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that the documents weren't saying with more precision. What came next was the layer-by-layer crumbling that denial undergoes when it has nowhere left to stand. First, she tried to question the legitimacy of the material, how it had been obtained, what right I had to have commissioned something like that without telling her anything. Tomas responded to that with the technical calm of someone who knows the law better than the person invoking it poorly. Then came the minimization, that it wasn't what it seemed, that there was context, that things between us hadn't been working for years, and she had felt lonely in ways I had never wanted to see. I listened to that part without interrupting because it was partially true and because partial truth deserves at least the space to be spoken. Then came the tears. I won't describe that in more detail than necessary, because it's not the kind of image one chooses to keep of someone with whom one shared 23 years. I'll just say they were real, not calculated, and that didn't change anything on the table. It was at that moment, when Encarnacion reached for the phone in her bag, that I understood what was going to happen next. She dialed Daniela's number and spoke in a low voice, half turning her back to me, with short, urgent sentences. Tomas and I waited in silence. Daniela arrived 20 minutes later. She came in with the rushed energy of someone coming to resolve an emergency, whose content she doesn't yet fully know. She saw her mother in the chair, with reddened eyes. She saw the documents on the table. She looked at me, and in the time it took her to scan that visual sequence, her expression reorganized into something I had never seen on her face until that moment. "What have you done?" she said to me. It wasn't a real question. It was the beginning of a position she had already chosen before sitting down. She spoke for several minutes. Some of the things she said were unfair. Some were painful to hear, not for being unfair, but for containing fragments of truth that I myself had recognized in earlier moments of this process, that I had worked too much, that there had been periods when I wasn't present in the way I should have been, that emotional distance also has consequences. All of that was true. None of it was the argument she thought it was. When Daniela finished speaking, Tomas opened the fourth folder, the thinnest one, without any additional comment. He placed it in front of her on the same table. Daniela lowered her gaze to the paper. I saw the exact moment she recognized what it was, the thread of messages between her and her mother, printed out with dates and times, with her own words written in black and white. "You have to be more careful. You know, all this is complicated. Thanks for not saying anything." The silence that followed was of a completely different nature from all the previous silences of that afternoon. It wasn't the silence of someone thinking of what to say. It was that of someone who has nowhere left to go with what they know. I stood up, not because I had finished processing everything in that room, but because there was nothing more I needed to say or hear at that moment. Every possible argument already had its answer on that table, in certified paper and with verifiable dates. Continuing to sit, there wasn't going to add anything that the documents hadn't already said better than me. I told Tomas I would call him the next day. Tomas nodded. I picked up my briefcase, put on my coat, and walked to the door without stopping. Behind me remained 3 folders on a table, 2 women in silence, and 23 years of a domestic life that had come to an end in the only way it could when the foundations no longer support anything. It was cold in the building's hallway. I walked down the stairs as I always did and went out into the street, where the morning fog had given way to a clean, dry darkness that smelled of uncompromising winter. I walked to the car, started the engine, and drove to Simone's school because it was Thursday, and on Thursdays I always picked him up. He was waiting for me at the gate with his red backpack on his shoulder and that expression of his of someone who has many things to tell and doesn't know where to start. He took my hand as he got onto the sidewalk, and we started walking. I said nothing for the first minute. Neither did he. Then he asked if we could stop at the corner bakery. I said yes. It was Thursday. Legal proceedings have their own time, not the time of people, which is urgent and emotional and full of irregular edges, but a slower and more methodical one, built on deadlines and notifications and transfers of documentation between offices that don't know each other but share the same formal language. I knew that rhythm from my work. I knew that impatience doesn't speed it up and that anxiety doesn't change any deadline. What does change the results is the solidity of the material with which one arrives. And in that, our position had no visible flaws. Encarnacion didn't accept the terms in Tomas's office that January afternoon. It was predictable. People rarely accept in the heat of the moment what forces them to yield in the cold. She left that meeting without signing anything, with Daniela by her side and the expression of someone who still hasn't finished calculating her options. The next day, Tomas filed a complaint. What happened over the following months wasn't a drama. It was a procedure. And procedures, when they're well-constructed, have an internal logic that needs no emotional intervention from any of the parties to move forward. Encarnacion hired a lawyer, Immaculada Soria Vega, 44 years old, with an office downtown. She was a competent professional, as Tomas told me after reviewing her first communications, but she was late to a game that was already well underway. The material we had left no room for effective contestation on the central points. The financial diversions were proven with official bank documentation. The dates allowed for no alternative interpretation, and the ownership of the receiving account was verifiable by any expert appointed by the court. Immaculada could work the margins. The margins don't change the central outcome. The mandatory pretrial mediation required by law and proceedings involving minors took place in February. It was a single session. The mediator, a man in his late 50s with the calm weariness of someone who's been doing this for decades, tried to find a point of agreement on custody. Encarnacion requested shared custody. With the support of the record of absences documented by Tomas and the history of primary care I could prove, requested primary custody of Simone with a visitation schedule for the mother. The mediation reached no agreement. The matter went to the judge. I want to be precise about something that seems important to me to tell. Throughout that period, Encarnacion continued to be Simone's mother. No document or process erased that. She continued to pick the boy up some days. She continued to call him in the afternoons. She continued to be the person he ran to when something hurt that he didn't know how to say with words. All of that continued to function because Simone was 7 years old and didn't have to bear the weight of what the adults around him had broken. In that, Encarnacion and I found the only ground where there was never any real conflict. The child was above everything else, and we both knew it, even if we couldn't say it to each other directly at that moment. What the judge decided in April, for months after the complaint was filed, was a judgment that Tomas described as solid on all its central points. Primary custody of Simone was assigned to me with a broad and structured visitation schedule for Encarnacion, alternate weekends, half of the school holidays, and the possibility of extending the schedule by mutual agreement, depending on how the situation evolved. It wasn't the exclusion of the mother, it was the recognition of who had exercised primary care consistently and documentedly. On the financial side, the judgment recognized the proven financial diversion and deducted it from the settlement of community property that was due to Encarnacion. The amount recovered wasn't just the 12,840 euros I had calculated in the pad of graph paper months ago, with legal interest and the costs associated with the process, which the judge attributed to the party that had caused the litigation. The total exceeded 17,300 euros. Tomas informed me by phone with the same neutral voice he would have used to report any other result, and I thanked him with the same calmness. The family apartment was awarded to me by virtue of being the habitual residence of the minor under my primary custody, with financial compensation to Encarnacion for her proportional share calculated on an official appraisal that the court commissioned from an independent expert. Encarnacion moved into a rented apartment in the new neighborhood, a 15-minute walk from what had been our home for 17 years. Regarding Leandro Crespo Barrios, I did nothing. I didn't need to. When the process documents were incorporated into the judicial record and the judgment became final, that documentation became publicly accessible within the limits established by law. It didn't take long to circulate among those who had reasons to be attentive to that type of information. In the circles of the local real estate sector, news affecting the personal reputation of a majority partner doesn't need any active messenger. It moves on its own through the same channels that any relevant business information moves. What happened to Leandro in his professional environment as a consequence of that wasn't my decision. It was a consequence of his. There was a day in May, with the judgment final and the process administratively closed, when I went to the bank alone to close the joint accounts and open a new one in my exclusive name. The process took less than half an hour. The employee who attended me was young, efficient, and completely oblivious to what that paper represented. I signed where I had to sign. I received the documentation I had to receive and went out into the street with a folder under my arm that weighed much less than everything I'd carried for the last 7 months. I stopped on the sidewalk in front of the bank with the May sun hitting the facades of the buildings opposite and the midday traffic filling the street with its ordinary noise. I thought about what Tomas had told me when we closed the process, that I had gotten what I had gone to seek, that the result was as good as could be expected given the circumstances, and that now what was needed was to move on. What was needed was to move on. It's a simple phrase. It fits in 4 words, but there are distances that aren't measured in kilometers, but in the space between what one was before all this began and what one finds when one looks for who one is now. That distance isn't closed by courts, or by recovered balances, or by any judgment, however solid it may be. What the process gave me back was real, and it was important. Simone's stability under a known roof, the assets I had built over decades of work, the clarity of knowing that what I had suspected was exactly what it was, and that I hadn't been wrong in any of the steps I took to prove it. All of that was valuable. I don't minimize it. What the process didn't give back was the other list, the one without columns or totals. The years when I believed that the life I had was the life I really had. The specific trust of a man who has slept next to the same person for decades and believes he knows her completely. Certain after-dinner conversations that now had a subtext that wasn't there before. The image of Daniela on the other side of that table, with her own words printed in front of her and her eyes on no particular place. No process gives that back. And to pretend it does would be the first lie I would have allowed myself in all this time, and I wasn't willing to start there. I put the folder under my arm, walked to the car, and started the engine. At 3:15, I had to be at the school. I wrote the letter to Daniela on a Sunday morning at the end of May, with Simone at Amelia's house, because Sunday mornings had become a time when the boy went down to the 4th floor to watch cartoons with her. A habit they had built on their own without anyone proposing it, and which I had no reason to interrupt. I sat at the office desk with a blank sheet of paper and stared at it for a long time before writing the first line. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because there are words that deserve the necessary time to find their exact form before being fixed on paper. I had thought about that letter for weeks. I had rehearsed different versions in my head, some longer with detailed explanations, others colder, purely formal. Neither extreme was what was appropriate. What was appropriate was the truth told with precision and without unnecessary cruelty, which isn't the same as without harshness. I wrote for 40 minutes. The letter took up a little over a page. It didn't accuse, didn't list grievances. It explained with the same clarity with which I had learned to draft any important document what my position was and what its practical consequences would be from that moment on. I told her that I knew what I knew, that I didn't need her to acknowledge it or justify herself, and that what she had done wasn't something on which I could build any continuity, that the bond between us had changed in nature irreversibly, not by a sudden decision of mine, but by hers, made months ago in silence, that this didn't mean I wished her any harm. It meant I couldn't continue to be the same father as before, as if nothing had happened, because to do so would be to lie to both of us. And I had had enough lies in the last year and a half to last the rest of my life. At the end of the letter, I added a single line that I hadn't planned to write, and which, however, was the one that came out most naturally of all, that if one day, after whatever time needed to pass, she wanted to have an honest conversation about all this, I would be willing to have it. But that conversation would have to start from the truth, not from the version that each of us found more comfortable to hold. I put it in an envelope, wrote her address by hand, and left it on the kitchen counter to take to the post office the next day. Daniela received the letter 4 days later. I know it arrived because Tomas confirmed that Encarnacion had called him to ask if I intended to maintain that position. Tomas replied that I did. There was no further communication on the matter for weeks. Daniela didn't call, didn't write. I expected it, or at least considered it possible. Silence as a response is also a choice. And choices have their own consequences, which don't need any external intervention to make themselves present. She would know it when the time came that she felt it. And that moment didn't depend on me. What did depend on me was what was left standing. And what was left standing was 7 years old, had messy hair by default, a red backpack that weighed more than it should for his size, and the habit of asking 3 questions in a row without waiting for an answer to any before throwing out the next. It took Simone a while to understand what had changed in the structure of his daily life. 7-year-old children don't process breakups like adults. What they perceive is the difference in the pattern, that mom is no longer at home when he wakes up, that there are nights when he sleeps in another apartment, that dad prepares breakfast on Saturday, though not always with the same order of things that mom used. There was a March afternoon, still in the midst of the legal process, when Simone asked me if mom and I were angry. I told him we weren't angry, that sometimes adults made different decisions about how to live, and that didn't change anything about what he had. He looked at me for a moment with that expression of someone calculating if the answer they received is the one they were looking for. And then he nodded and asked me if there was orange juice in the fridge. There was. There always was, that I could guarantee. Over time, Simone built his own way of moving between the two spaces. Children have an adaptability that adults have lost along the way, not because they're stronger, but because they live more in the present and less in the comparison between what was and what is. I learned something from that by observing him. Not enough to not miss certain things, but enough to understand that grief and daily life aren't incompatible, that they can coexist on the same day without one destroying the other. I picked up some things I had left behind without realizing it over the years. I started going for walks in the mornings before Simone woke up, half an hour through the neighborhood park with the cold still in the air and the city starting up slowly. I reconnected with a couple of people who had been buried under the obligations of a life that always had something more urgent to do. I read books that weren't reports, small things that don't solve anything big, but that returned to the day a texture that had become too smooth. One afternoon in June, while tidying up the office, I found Aurelio's brown folder at the back of the wardrobe drawer. I held it in my hand for a moment. It no longer contained anything that wasn't resolved. I opened it anyway. I took out the first photograph, the one showing Encarnacion with her back to the camera on the street behind Simone's school, and I looked at it for a few seconds. Then I put it back inside, closed the folder, and put it in the bag of documents to be destroyed that I hadn't taken to the secure recycling point of the office for weeks. Some papers are only useful while they're needed. When they're no longer needed, keeping them isn't prudence. It's something else that doesn't have a pretty name. On Tuesday, June 16th, almost 8 months after the October Tuesday that had started all, I picked Simone up at the school gate at 3:15. It was one of the last days of the school year. The June sun on the plateau has that particular quality that flattens everything a bit, that makes the colors more direct and the shadows sharper. The gate was full of children and adults with the relaxed rhythm of the end of the year, with that collective energy of someone who already feels summer is near, even if there's still a few days left. I saw Simone before he saw me. He came out among a group of classmates with his red backpack slung over one shoulder, as always, with his hair messy and his shirt half tucked out of his pants. He was talking to another boy as he walked with that total concentration children have when the topic seems genuinely important to them. He saw me when he was already 10 meters away. He raised his hand. I walked towards him. When I reached him, I bent down for a moment to put the backpack on both his shoulders, which was what I always did because otherwise, at the end of the day, his right shoulder would hurt. He protested slightly, as he always protested when I did that, and then he let it go as he always let it go. We started walking towards the long street, the one that goes by the square with the stone fountain. Almost 8 months ago, on an October afternoon that smelled of damp earth and roasted chestnuts, this boy had come home with that same backpack and had said 12 words between one bite and the next that had changed the course of everything. He didn't know it then, and he didn't know it now either. And I had no intention of telling him until he was old enough and had the necessary distance to understand everything those 12 words had meant and everything they had cost. Because there are things that children don't need to carry before their time. He was already carrying enough with that red backpack he insisted on wearing on one shoulder. He asked me if we could stop at the corner bakery. It was Tuesday. I said yes. And as we walked towards the corner with the June sun on our backs and the city moving around us with its usual indifference, I thought that if there's one thing you learn after building and losing and rebuilding for more than 50 years, it's this. That life doesn't warn you when it's going to change, that the moments that alter everything usually arrive without fanfare, with a full mouth and a backpack on your shoulder, and that the only thing a man can control isn't what happens to him, but the clarity with which he decides to face it. That's what I want Simone to learn one day, not from my words, from what he sees. The rest he'll find on his own, as we all do.